Are there different kinds of conscience? Hi, I'm Mike Mason. This is St. Joe Society podcast. The St. Joe Society is a Catholic lay apostolate devoted to help men order all things to Christ by growing strong in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can check us out online at stjosephsociety.org. All right, gentlemen, this is the Intro to Moral Theology, episode 23. We are 2 episodes away from wrapping up our Intro to Moral Theology we've been working on for the last 5.5 months. Last week, we discussed how a person's conscience works, okay, and walk through that. This week, we're going to talk about different kinds of conscience. Now, when I say different kinds of conscience, what I don't mean is like, floating inside of you is 6 different kinds of conscience that you employ at different times, something like that. Like, there's different kinds of animals like dogs, cats, cows, horses. What I mean by different kinds of conscience is our conscience is one, right? It resides in the intellect. Our conscience is the connection between objective moral laws and how those apply to particular actions in our lives here and now. What I mean about different kinds of consciences, different conditions of conscience, or different ways of understanding how the conscience works, stuff like that. So when we talk about different kinds of conscience, we talk about the difference between an antecedent and a consequent conscience. We talk about the difference between a correct and erroneous conscience. And we talk about the difference between a certain and a doubtful conscience. And so we're going to look at these 6 kinds and compare them with each other, because this is different ways in which your conscience, functions within you. And once you understand these different ways in which it functions, it can help us understand how to make good choices, how to reflect on ones we made beforehand, and then what to do when we're not really sure what should be done. So really important to hammer these things out. Okay, so we're going to talk about these 3 pairs, and then at the end, I'll give you kind of a practical takeaway based on all of it. So let's start with an antecedent versus a consequent conscience. Okay, antecedent, consequent, we're using the words just like you do in grammar class or whatever. Antecedent refers to before, consequent after. An antecedent conscience is when your conscience is guiding future choices, okay? So let's say you have something comes up where you have an opportunity to tell a lie, and your conscience sits there and goes, okay, lying's wrong. If I say this thing, that's definitely going to be a lie. Therefore, I shouldn't say it. That's an antecedent conscience. Okay. A consequent conscience is when you do something and then afterwards reflect back on it and say, should I have done that? Okay. And if you should have done it and you did it, you can give yourself, a pat on the back, some approval there. If you shouldn't have done it and you did, there would be some remorse. Okay. So antecedent conscience is before you act. Consequent conscience is after you act. For moral theology, the antecedent conscience is more important because we want to make sure we're making good choices, not to put ourselves in bad situations. That'd be a lack of prudence. Or should we be in a bad situation or under a certain amount of temptations, we know what to do, and that'd be the antecedents. That one's way more important than the other. So that's the first 2 types. The second kind of conscience is a correct or erroneous conscience. A correct conscience is when just that, your conscience is correct in its value statement. An erroneous conscience is when your conscience is incorrect or in error. So a correct conscience judges as good what is really good, and evil what is really evil. So if your conscience is correct, it's making a judgment that this thing's evil and you're correct on that. This thing's evil and you're also correct on that. An erroneous conscience judges what is good and calls it evil, or calls that which is evil good. Okay, so it says, all right, this thing that's objectively really good, an erroneous conscience says, no, that thing's evil. And then something that is evil, you count as good. So think about a person who maybe reads the Beatitudes, right? Matthew, in the book of Matthew. So he reads through the Beatitudes. As he reads through them, he thinks to himself, this type of moral advice is not good. Okay, that would be an erroneous conscience. So if you look at what Christ taught in the Beatitudes, and you draw the conclusion that this is false, your conscience is in error. Okay. A person then says, well, I'm not going to believe the Beatitudes. I'm going to live a life of, selfish material gain. I'm going to chase pleasures and, acquire for myself all the temporal and material goods of this world. Well, calling that good, that's actually an evil. Not that material goods and those things are evil in themselves, but pursuing them as if that's the goal in life, that would certainly be an error. Okay. When your conscience is in error, and we're going back to when we talked about modifiers of freedom last month. Okay. When your conscience is in error, the error can be vincible or invincible. So if your conscience is in error and it's vincibly erroneous, that means it's capable of being overcome and the judgment corrected. So vincible errors are things that you are wrong and in error, but you can overcome them. This is one of the reasons why in our rule of life, study is part of it. Okay, that 2 times a week you have to set time aside to learn your faith. Why? Because a lot of times we make errors theologically and morally that can be overcome so long as we're diligent. We want to make sure we're diligent. That's a vincible error. An invincible erroneous conscience is when the error cannot be overcome in any sort of reasonable sense. Okay. Remember, for something to be morally obligatory, it has to be possible. And so if a person their conscience is in error and there's really nothing they can do about it, at least at that point in time, that would be an invincibly erroneous conscience. Okay. So that distinction is important for reasons we talked about last month, which I won't recycle this month. Okay, the last one we need to talk about is the difference between a certain and a doubtful conscience. A certain conscience is when you judges something, when your conscience is certain, you're making a judgment and you have no fear that the opposite might be true. Okay, so let's take, I think I've used an example in the past of smoking methamphetamines. Okay. When all of us sit here and go, yeah, that's really morally bad and physically bad. It's just bad. Okay. I doubt any of us are doubtful about that. No, we're all like, no, I'm certainly 100% true that is bad for someone. Okay. That's what a certain conscience is. A doubtful conscience either hesitates to make any judgment at all. So it's when the person's like, they're looking at this moral dilemma and they're really not know where to go with it one way or the other. And so they're really hesitant to make a judgment. Okay. That's one way a conscience can be doubtful. The other way is that a person may go ahead and choose one of the two, but they really are unsure if the other one's the right way to go. So when your conscience is in doubt, you either don't act at all or you do act, but you're like, I could really be wrong here. When it comes to a certain conscience, okay, there's 2 rules that come with certain and doubtful consciences. And this will be our takeaway. So I'll circle back to this at the end. The 2 chief rules are this: you must always obey a certain conscience. Always. Guys, if you think something is truly good, you need to do it. If you think something is truly bad, you need to avoid it. Okay. You always, always, always obey a certain conscience. Always. You do not want to build the habit where your will or your appetites overcome your conscience and violate it. You do not want to develop that habit. Okay. You want that intellect making a judgment, that conscience making a judgment, and your will follows in right behind it. Okay. That's the habit we want to be into. When it comes to a doubtful conscience, don't act with that thing. If you're not sure what needs to be done, don't do it. Okay. Because if you act with a doubtful conscience, if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, I shouldn't do this thing, or I'm not really sure what I should do here, I'm going to go ahead and do it. If it turns out to be wrong, you still own the moral responsibility for that. So you have to own that. So if your conscience is doubtful, don't act at all, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're doing things that are objectively wrong and you're accountable for them. Okay. So always act with a certain conscience. Always. Never act with a doubtful. Now, as I've laid these out, you guys might see, and this will kind of wrap up here, you might see an issue that might spring up. Okay. Notice the difference between a correct conscience and a certain conscience. When your conscience is correct, that means it's correct objectively. It means the judgment your conscience is making matches up with reality. So it's objective. A certain conscience is subjective. It's in you. Okay. So a correct conscience means the judgment you're making matches reality. A certain conscience is the degree of certainty which you have. Now notice the 2 possibilities. Your conscience can be certain and correct. Okay. So you guys could make a judgment of conscience where you're like, I know I'm 100% right. And lucky for you, it is 100% right. A certain and correct conscience offers no difficulty at all. Okay. Because the obligation is really clear. If you're like, I shouldn't smoke methamphetamines, therefore I'm 100% sure that's the case, pretty straightforward. Don't do that. Okay. The problem pops up with the other possibility. Your conscience can be certain, which you're like, I know I'm supposed to do this, or I know I'm supposed to avoid that, but it can be erroneous. Okay. What do we do then? Well, if you have an erroneous conscience, okay, so you think you're right, but it's not correct. First, if the error is vincible, you have to correct it. So this is with children a lot, right? They'll think they're like, I think I'm doing the right thing. And they will find out as they reflect back on their decision that they were actually, in fact, wrong. If their error is vincible, you just have to correct it. Okay, this is why for some cases, a person can do something objectively wrong and not be accountable for it because of age, because they lack experience. Okay, so for example, St. Thomas Aquinas once was asked, when a person is getting drunk, always mortally sinful? And he said, no, because the first time a person gets drunk, it's possible that they didn't intend to do that. Why? Because they didn't know how much alcohol they could handle. Okay. And so it might be what they did was objectively wrong, but they're not subjectively accountable. Okay. A lot of things, if you guys think when we're growing up, when we're young, a lot of things we do, we think we're right. And then upon reflection, we're like, that was not a good idea. Okay. That's when your conscience is certain in error, but there's vincible. What do we do if the error is invincible? Okay. What if happens if we think we're right, we're actually wrong, but we don't know we're wrong and we can't overcome that? Okay. On one hand, it doesn't seem like the person should follow an erroneous judgment, right? So if they're wrong, it seems like they shouldn't follow it. On the other hand, okay, if they think they're right, they should follow it. So what do we do? Okay. When a person acts with an invincibly erroneous conscience, okay, this is when they think they're right, but they're wrong, but they don't know it. Okay. When they act, okay, they are definitely doing something objectively wrong. But because they don't recognize that and their error is invincible, it's not subjectively wrong in the sense of they're not morally responsible for what they do. So even though they are objectively wrong, they're not subjectively culpable or responsible for what they did. Now, if you do something that's objectively wrong, you're still going to suffer natural consequences that come from doing that wrong thing. So they're still going to suffer that, but they don't have a moral responsibility. Okay. I know that last little bit was a little bit dense there. Okay. But the point is that kind of to wrap up here is when it comes to our consciences, guys, we need to exercise our consciences both antecedently and consequently. We need to think about what we do before we do it. That's antecedent. We need to be reflecting upon our choices after we make them so we can learn from them. Second, our consciences also need to be correct, can be correct or erroneous. We need to make sure that what we're making judgments on are truly correct and that we're not in error. If we make errors and we can fix them, we need to fix them. Lastly, we always should act with a certain conscience. Anytime our conscience tells us to do something, we should always act on it, and we should never act with a doubtful one. Okay. If we keep these categories and kinds of conscience in mind, this will give us a tool to keep growing ethically. Okay. And so as we discuss the moral and spiritual life further in future episodes, you guys will start having a clear understanding of what the correct moral path is, the path God's trying to lead you on for your salvation. All right. We're butting up against the end of our time period together, so I'll stop there. Feel free to check out the notes I included on the website, and I hope you guys have a blessed week. See you next time.